What is today Latin America was once many native nations. Spain, Portugal, France, England, the Dutch, and Danish all invaded. They carried out genocide after genocide and enslaved both natives and Africans. After independence, most new governments were still white-dominated, with more genocides against natives in nations like Argentina, Brazil, and Chile. European powers hold onto some territories even today and kept invading to take their colonies back. The United States invaded too, overthrowing or trying to overthrow over 60 governments, the last attempt in the year 2020 in Venezuela. The U.S. also took half of Mexico's land and a tenth of its people, then Puerto Rico and the Virgin Islands. There's a long history of many Americans fearing and hating Latinos. Latin America's image and reality is often one of instability, poverty, drug cartels, revolutions, corruption, and refugees. But it did not have to be this way. Latin America could remain all or mostly native nations. I spoke about this in detail in the previous series, What If Natives Won? Poverty, white domination, and foreign invasions could have been stopped, prevented, or limited. The U.S. could have been more Latino culturally, with higher numbers of Latinos. The U.S. could have been less racist, less dominating, or the U.S. could be defeated. Some Latin American nations could even become regional or world powers. There's a huge lack of alternate history about Latin America and Latinos. So much alternate history is Europe-centered, mostly because so much history and history teaching is Europe-centered. This series is dedicated to scenarios, points of departure, and possibilities of Latin American victory within Latin America, or a more Latino or less racist American society. My name is Carroll. I'm Associate Professor of History at Northern Virginia Community College. I've written mostly about wars, veterans, human rights, and genocide. My next history book will be Genocide Denial in America, about the 7 genocides against indigenous people that took place in the U.S. that most people were never taught about, don't know, or deny. I've also written some science fiction, mostly alternate history. One story, Timely Saviors, appears in a short story collection, The Witness Paradox. I'm also, together with Rob Schmidt of Blue Corn Comics, editing and putting out a short story alternate history collection, What If Natives Won? I've also written a sci-fi alternate history book, The Man in Black, the first of a series. Cuba has a huge effect on world history because of one set of brothers, Fidel and Raul Castro. If Cuba is independent sooner, there is little chance they lead the nation. Most Americans don't know much about Cuba except where the U.S. is involved. They're taught a little bit about the Spanish-American War, a lot about the Cuban Missile Crisis, and hear a lot of distorted and sometimes hysterical claims coming from the Cuban exile community. Cuba had long been a colony of Spain's. Spanish colonists almost exterminated natives on the island, then ruled over a large slave population with extreme brutality. Partly because sugar was so profitable, Spain held onto the island by extreme force for 70 to 80 years after most of their other colonies won independence. There are 5 earlier times Cuba could have won independence before it did. One is the same as other Latin American independence wars. There were also numerous slave revolts and independence movement conspiracies in both Cuba and Puerto Rico. One reason they failed was that the law made it easy for slaves to buy their freedom. By the time of the independence movement in the other Spanish colonies, free blacks outnumbered slaves in Cuba. Many slave owners fleeing from Haiti and Florida also moved to Cuba. If either one had not happened, slave revolts or independence movements are likelier to win. Either or both, Cuba and Puerto Rico could be another Haiti, republics of former slaves who win but suffer from heavy losses. The second time Cuba could be independent sooner was the failed American mercenary invasions, often called filibusters, led by Narciso Lopez. Lopez was Venezuelan and a former colonel in the Spanish army. He recruited Cuban exiles in New York to fight for Cuban independence. U.S. President Zachary Taylor blocked his ships from leaving, so Lopez started recruiting in southern states, and this time it was with Southerners interested in another slave state for the U.S. 3 times he invaded, but he found no local support, and finally he was executed. If Taylor had not blocked him, or if Lopez had not recruited many American foreigners, he has much more of a chance of success. These invasions were from 1849 to 1851. If Cuba was independent earlier, the U.S. may try to seize it, except that U.S. President Taylor opposes that. So did the next American president, Millard Fillmore, who favored compromise over slavery. If slavery advocates do force an invasion, Cuba is another slave state, and there may be an earlier U.S. Civil War. Cuba would then quickly be taken by Union troops. The Confederacy only had a small navy, very poorly run, almost all of them just pirates who preyed on civilian ships. Cuba as a U.S. state would be the first time Latinos could vote in large numbers. It would also hold on to the Spanish language and Cuban culture, just like states in the Southwest have many Spanish speakers, and hold on to Mexican culture. Cuba likely would be as much of a beach resort and retirement state as Florida is today. The third time for a possible independence was during the 10 Years' War, or the Little War after it. Cuba fought both wars for independence in the 1860s and 1870s. Both these wars were extremely brutal, with a high death toll mostly from Spanish outright concentration camps. Both the wars ended in truces, but Spain had to abolish slavery. If Cuban rebels win, there's no reason it wouldn't be permanently independent, and almost as radical in our own timeline, because again, it's a nation of former slaves who won their freedom by force, by very violent revolution with a high cost. One other way is independence right before the Spanish-American War. This independence effort was led by Cuba's George Washington figure, José Martí. Martí was killed, but in spite of Spanish repression, Cubans drove Spanish troops out of 2/3 of the island before the U.S. ever declared war against Spain. Martí was strongly opposed to the U.S., quote, "to sell Cuba's sovereignty to the clever neighbor which wants to bleed us dry on our very doorstep in order to grab, with its hostile hands, its selfish and disrespectful hands, what fertile land is left of ours. A Martí-led Cuba doesn't let Americans in except as tourists or silent investors, but not land or business owners. This will be a leftist but not a socialist Cuba, and still very anti-imperialist." An independent Cuba in the 1890s means William Hearst has to find a new cause to boost his circulation with a propaganda campaign. Without a Spanish-American War, Teddy Roosevelt may never rise to be a national figure, at least not this way. There is no Battle of San Juan Hill, and none of Roosevelt posing as a war hero when his total time at war was a few weeks, and his total time in combat a few hours against an outnumbered, outgunned, exhausted enemy. Teddy Roosevelt will be a noisy nationalist on the sidelines. The U.S. will be less imperialist for longer, maybe until World War I. A side effect of all these is no Spanish-American War means Hawaii becomes independent again. American plantation owners had taken over by force. The American public and president had refused to make it part of the U.S. Not until the war, the Spanish-American War, did this public opinion change. Without war hysteria, the plantation owners will fall to rebellion by native Hawaiians and Asian plantation workers. Or Japan may invade, and Hawaii becomes independent again after World War II. Another effect will be an independent Philippines. Filipino rebels had already kicked out Spain out of their entire country, except for the capital. Then American troops invaded and betrayed their Filipino allies and conquered the Philippines with great brutality, killing at least 200,000 Filipinos, many of them in outright massacres, including of children. All of that is avoided. The Philippines gained independence on their own in late 1898. Both nations might face American economic domination or manipulation, but they will never be American colonies. Guam would also be independent. Likely Japan seizes it from Spain in World War II or the Spanish Civil War. it becomes a U.S. trust territory after the war. And like the other trust territories, it gains independence in the 1980s. And it will be renamed, as many independence activists refer to it by their more traditional name, Guahan, not Guam. Any of these earlier independence movements means, more than likely, no Castro as Cuba's ruler. He may be a noisy but eloquent senator in Cuba's Congress, as they would have been had Batista not shut it down. That may also mean apartheid in South Africa lasts longer, since Cubans helped liberate that nation, and Namibia, and Angola. It also means Florida is very different without Cuban exiles, and so are some aspects of American elections. This is the end of the video. Please repost freely, like, quote, and comment. This has been Latin American Victory. Next time we will discuss, what if the U.S. sets Cuba and Puerto Rico free and independent?